The wind howled, a brutal, unseen predator scouring the desolate peaks of the Montana Rockies. It carried with it a swirling blizzard that painted the world in shades of white and grey. The cold was a physical thing, a blade that sliced through the thick wool of Silas Vance's overcoat. Inside the covered wagon, he was arguing with his driver, a nervous man named Arthur, who kept his hands clamped so tight on the reins they were turning blue. "I told you we should have waited out the storm in Helena," Arthur shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind's shriek. "These roads are a death trap." Silas Vance, a man whose entire life was a testament to calculated risks, scoffed. He was a banker, a man who dealt in numbers, not in the whims of nature. His face, sharp and angular, was a mask of cold resolve. "Nonsense, Arthur. The route is well travelled. We have a schedule to keep. Besides, I have important documents here. A delay is unacceptable." A muffled sigh came from the back of the wagon. Eleanor Vance, Silas's daughter, was curled beneath a heavy buffalo hide, her face pale. She was a woman of delicate features, and an education that made her more comfortable in a drawing room than on a treacherous mountain pass. Her heart was a hummingbird in her chest, a frantic beat of worry. The journey had been her father's idea, a show of his unwavering confidence, a display of his authority over his business rivals. He was carrying a ledger detailing a series of questionable land deals, information that could destroy some very powerful men. Eleanor knew this, and the knowledge was a cold weight in the pit of her stomach. "Father," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "perhaps Arthur is right. We could have taken the train." Silas gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "The train is for cowards, Eleanor. We are Vances. We don't hide from a bit of snow. And besides, trust me, this ledger is too valuable to risk in a public setting." Just then, a sharp crack echoed through the air, distinct from the howl of the wind. A horse whinnied in pain, and the wagon lurched violently. Arthur let out a terrified yell as the right front wheel splintered, sending the carriage careening into a deep snowdrift. The world became a dizzying kaleidoscope of white, and Eleanor was thrown hard against the side of the wagon. Her head hit something solid, and for a moment her vision swam. When the dizzy spell passed, she pushed herself up, her ears ringing. The wagon was tilted at a perilous angle, half buried in a bank of snow. Outside, the sounds of chaos replaced the wind's monotonous roar. Shouts, the sharp, unmistakable report of a rifle, her father's frantic, booming voice. "Get back, you scoundrels! I have a shotgun! Silas Vance!" A rough voice roared. "Hand over the ledger, and no one gets hurt." Eleanor scrambled to the window slit, her heart hammering. Through the blur of snow, she saw two figures on horseback, their faces obscured by scarves and hats. They were big men, built for violence, one of them dismounted, a rifle in his hand. He was walking toward her father. Silas Vance was a man of words and numbers, not of combat. He held a double-barreled shotgun, but his hands were shaking. He was a lion in a cage, a man whose bravery was outmatched by the raw force of the wilderness and the ruthlessness of his enemies. "I won't give you a thing," Silas yelled. "This information will bury you all." A mocking laugh followed. "You won't be able to tell anyone anything, old man." The sound that followed was a sickening thud, a brutal, final noise that Eleanor knew instinctively. The man with the rifle had not shot her father. He had used the butt of the weapon. Silas Vance fell face first into the snow, motionless. Eleanor let out a choked sob, clamping a hand over her mouth. She needed to be silent. She needed to be invisible. Arthur, the driver, was already gone, having bolted in a panic. The horse lay on its side, a dark stain spreading on the pristine white. The two men were now rummaging through the wagon, their voices a low, menacing growl. She could hear them cursing as they searched for the ledger. They were not just common thieves. They were after something specific, something that belonged to her father. "Where is it?" one of them snarled. "I know he has it. It's not here. The old man must have it on him." Eleanor's body was a block of ice. She knew her father had hidden the ledger. He'd told her as much, a precaution in case of a robbery. It wasn't on his person. It was hidden inside the wagon, under a false floorboard she was sitting on. She could feel the faint outline of the small leather-bound book beneath the heavy hide she was still using as a blanket. The sound of footsteps came closer. One of the men was on the side of the wagon, tugging at the door. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. She had to do something. In her moment of panic, a detail from her father's many lectures flashed into her mind. In a life-or-death situation, Eleanor, you must be a ghost. Unseen, unheard, and gone before they know you were there. She slid her hand under the hide, her fingers brushing against the cold leather of the ledger. She had to get it out of here. This book was a death sentence. Her father had died for it. The door to the wagon burst open with a groan of stressed wood and splintered metal. Eleanor held her breath. The man's shadow filled the opening. He was a huge figure, his breath steaming in the freezing air. He glanced around the empty space, his eyes scanning for anything of value. She was half hidden by a trunk and the thick blanket, and in the dim light of the snowstorm, he didn't see her. He let out a frustrated grunt. "It's empty! The girl must have been with him, though. She's gone now." The men began to search the area around the wagon. They were convinced she had fled into the storm. Eleanor seized her chance. She clutched the ledger to her chest and slid out the back of the wagon, where the tarp had been torn loose by the impact. She fell into a deep drift, the snow cushioning her fall. The cold hit her like a physical blow, a sudden shocking numbness that spread from her toes to her fingers. She crawled away, a silent phantom in the blizzard. The world was nothing but a canvas of white, the snow falling in thick, heavy curtains. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she had to get away. She could hear the men's angry shouts growing fainter behind her, lost in the shriek of the wind. The snow was up to her knees, making every step a monumental effort. Her feet were numb. Her hands, without gloves, were quickly losing all sensation. The weight of the ledger, a small, insignificant thing, felt like an anchor around her neck, but she couldn't let it go. It was her father's legacy, the last remnant of his life. She stumbled on, a single solitary figure in a world of endless white. She didn't know which direction was safety, or if there was any safety to be found. All she knew was the gnawing cold and the horrifying knowledge that she was utterly alone. Her journey had begun, a desperate, silent march through a world that was trying to kill her, and she had no one to help her. For Eleanor Vance, the banker's daughter, the nightmare was just beginning. She had 4 days to walk alone in the snow. The first day was a blur of motion fueled by pure adrenaline. Eleanor Vance walked, or more accurately stumbled, through the relentless snowstorm. Her expensive leather boots, designed for the sidewalks of Helena, were no match for the deep drifts. They were soaked through, and her toes had long since lost all feeling. The cold was a constant, malevolent presence, a whisper in her ear telling her to stop, to rest, to give up. She clutched the leather-bound ledger to her chest like a lifeline. It was a strange comfort, a physical connection to her father, who was now a silent, forgotten figure back at the ruined wagon. The thought of him, lying dead in the snow, sent a fresh wave of tears down her already numb face. But the cold instantly froze them on her cheeks. Her mind, however, was a battlefield. One part of her, the logical, educated part, screamed at her to find shelter. But where? The mountains were an endless, unforgiving expanse of rock and trees, all cloaked in a uniform blanket of white. There was no sign of a trail, no cabin, no light in the distance. The other part of her mind, the primitive survivalist part, told her to just keep moving. Movement meant warmth, stasis meant death. By noon, the hunger had set in, a hollow ache in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the brutal cold was burning through her body's energy reserves at an alarming rate. She saw a stand of tall pines and considered trying to climb one to find some shelter from the wind. But her hands were too stiff, her muscles too weak. She couldn't even feel the bark. She was no longer the banker's daughter. The fine clothes, the proper manners, the delicate constitution, they were all useless here. She was just a person, a fragile human being fighting a losing battle against nature. Every step was a conscious act of will. Her legs felt like lead, and her lungs burned with the effort of breathing the freezing air. Toward evening, as the light began to fade, a sense of deep despair set in. Eleanor found a small, overhanging rock that offered a sliver of protection from the wind. She huddled beneath it, shivering uncontrollably. The cold had moved beyond her extremities and was now a deep, bone-aching ache in her core. She was in danger of falling asleep, a fatal, peaceful surrender to the cold. She slapped her face hard with a numb hand. The pain, though faint, was a necessary jolt. Her father's voice in her memory was sharp. "Never give up, Eleanor." Vance always sees things through to the end. He hadn't given up, and neither would she. The ledger was her reason to keep going. She had to honor his sacrifice. She had to keep moving. She forced herself to stand, her muscles protesting with every movement. She stumbled back into the open, the falling snow her only companion. She walked through the darkness, relying on the faint moonlight filtering through the storm clouds to guide her. She lost all sense of time, of direction. She was a ship without a compass, a ghost in the vast empty sea of the mountains. The second day was worse. The snowstorm had eased to a continuous heavy fall, but the temperature had dropped even further. She was now in a state of delirium, her thoughts a jumble of memories and fear. She saw her father's face in the patterns of the snow, heard her mother's gentle voice in the wind. Her feet were now just numb lumps. She knew she had blisters, but she couldn't feel them. She found a small stream frozen over and used a rock to break a hole in the ice. The water was a shock to her hands, a searing, painful cold, but she drank from it greedily. It was a temporary reprieve, but it reawakened the gnawing hunger. Her body was crying out for food. She saw nothing, not an animal, not a berry bush, nothing but the endless, unforgiving white. By the third day she was barely moving. Her clothes were a frozen shell, her hair a tangle of ice. She had hallucinations, seeing a warm cabin just over the next ridge, a campfire in the distance. Each time the illusion dissolved, leaving her with the bitter reality of her situation. She was close to death. She knew it. The cold was a comfort now, a numbing embrace. She wasn't shivering anymore, and she knew that was a terrible sign. She fell, and this time she didn't have the strength to get up immediately. She lay in the snow, her face half buried, her mind drifting. She was going to die here, alone. The thought was not terrifying anymore. It was just a quiet acceptance. She had tried. She had walked for 3 days. She had carried the ledger. It was enough. She let her eyes close. A noise, faint but distinct, broke through her stupor. A crackling sound, like the snap of a twig underfoot. She forced her eyes open, her vision blurry. A large shape was moving toward her. Her first thought was that it was a wolf, a silent, predatory ghost of the wilderness. She was too weak to be afraid. She just waited. But it wasn't a wolf. It was a man, a big man, wrapped in a heavy sheepskin coat. He was on foot, not on a horse. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and his face was hidden beneath a thick beard and the brim of a wide hat, all covered in a fine dusting of snow. He stopped a few feet away, his head cocked to the side. He knelt down, and she could see his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, filled with a mixture of surprise and caution. He was looking at her, not with pity, but with a hunter's assessment. He saw her for what she was, a lost, frozen thing on the brink of death. He didn't speak. He just reached out a hand, his fingers thick and calloused. She looked at his hand, then at his face. A question passed between them, an unspoken moment of decision. She had to decide whether to trust this man, this stranger who had found her in this desolate place. He was her only hope. He looked at her again, his expression unreadable, And then he spoke. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, a sound as deep as the mountains themselves. "Come," he said. It wasn't a question or a request. It was an order, a simple command that cut through the silence of the blizzard. And she, the banker's daughter, who had walked alone for 4 days, reached out and took his hand. The hand that took hers was rough, calloused, and surprisingly warm. It was the first human touch Eleanor had felt in 4 days. The simple word, "come," was a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she let him pull her to her feet. Her legs buckled, and she would have fallen again if not for his grip. He didn't speak again. He just wrapped an arm around her, supporting her weight as they began to walk. His pace was steady and unhurried, a stark contrast to her panicked stumbling. The world was still a white, hazy blur, but now there was a rhythm to her movement, a purpose. She was no longer walking alone. She was aware of the weight of the ledger still clutched in her hand. It was a useless burden now, a symbol of a past life that was no longer hers. She was now just a human being, a fragile shell, being led to an uncertain future. She stumbled, and he tightened his grip, a silent show of strength. He was a mountain of a man, his presence a shield against the biting wind. They walked for what felt like an eternity. The snow continued to fall, a relentless curtain. Eleanor's mind was a fog, a hazy mixture of exhaustion and cold. She was barely conscious of the world around her, only of the steady pace beside her and the warmth of his arm around her. Finally, a light appeared in the distance, a faint, flickering glow that cut through the gloom. It was a cabin, a single, solitary building nestled in a small valley, a wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. The sight of it brought a fresh wave of tears to Eleanor's eyes, this time not of fear, but of profound relief. He led her to the door. It was made of thick, heavy wood. He pushed it open, and a wave of warm air hit her face, a physical shock after so many days in the cold. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, something comforting and rustic. He helped her inside, easing her onto a wooden bench beside a large stone fireplace. A fire roared within, casting a warm, dancing light on the rough-hewn log walls. Eleanor felt her body begin to thaw, a painful, tingling sensation that moved from her fingertips and toes inward. It was excruciating, but it was a sign of life. He didn't say a word. He just moved with an efficient, quiet grace. He took off his coat and hung it on a hook, revealing a broad-shouldered frame and a simple wool shirt. He was a man of the mountains, a man who lived a life of solitude and hard work. He had a rifle leaning in a corner and a worn leather satchel on a table. He returned with a heavy wool blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth was a blessed relief. Then he knelt beside the fireplace, a cast-iron kettle over the flames. He was making something for her. He was caring for her, a stranger. Eleanor, her voice a raspy whisper, finally spoke. "Thank you." He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. There was no pity in them, just a quiet, stoic understanding. "Don't thank me yet," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're not out of the woods." He handed her a tin mug. Inside was a steaming liquid. She took a sip. It was hot, bitter, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It was a simple broth, but it filled her with a new kind of warmth, one that spread through her stomach and chased away the last vestiges of the chill. She finally got a better look at him. His face, though weathered and lined, was not unkind. He had a thick, brown beard and hair that was long and unkempt. His eyes held a deep sadness, a silent history of hardship. He was a man who had seen too much. She noticed her hand was still clutching the ledger. She looked at it, then at him. This is why they did it." He didn't ask what she was talking about. He just nodded, as if he already knew the story. "You can tell me in the morning," he said. "For now, you need to rest. You're lucky you didn't lose your feet." She looked down at her feet, still encased in the soaked boots. She hadn't realized how bad they were. He knelt down, and with gentle but firm hands began to unlace them. It was a strange intimacy, a stranger removing her boots. She didn't flinch. She just watched as he peeled away the soggy leather, revealing her pale, wrinkled and blistered feet. The sight of them made her want to weep, but she was too tired. He treated her feet with a salve and then wrapped them in clean linen. His hands were a study in contradictions, rough from labor, yet gentle in their care. The pain was still there, a constant throb, but it was a manageable pain now. He gestured to a bed, a simple cot with a straw mattress, covered in a thick quilt. "You can sleep there." She was too weak to protest. She lay down, pulling the quilt up to her chin. The warmth of the fire and the comforting scent of the cabin filled her senses. She was safe. For the first time in days, she felt safe. The exhaustion of her 4-day ordeal was a heavy blanket, and she surrendered to it completely. The last thing she saw before she fell asleep was him sitting in a chair, watching her. His eyes, the same piercing blue as the sky, were filled with a distant sadness. She was a stranger in his world, a world of solitude and quiet reflection, and he, the rancher with a solitary life, was now her unexpected guardian. The smell of coffee and frying bacon woke Eleanor. She stirred, her body a collection of aches and pains, a symphony of protest from muscles she hadn't known she had. The first thing she noticed was the light, a bright, clear sunbeam streaming through the single window of the cabin. The blizzard was over. The world outside was a pristine, blinding white. She sat up, the quilt sliding to her waist. She was no longer in her frozen, soaked clothes. Someone had changed them. A pang of mortification shot through her, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of gratitude. She was wearing a simple, clean, homespun dress, too big for her frame but blessedly warm. Her own clothes were hanging on a line near the fireplace, steaming. He was there, sitting at a small wooden table, a mug of coffee in his hand. He hadn't changed clothes. His beard and hair were still wild, but he was clean. He gestured with his chin to a plate of bacon and 2 slices of toast on the table. "Eat," he said, his voice still low and steady. "You need the strength." Eleanor ate without hesitation. The food was simple, but it was nourishment, and her body was starved for it. She ate slowly, savoring every bite. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. After she finished, she felt a little more human. Her mind was clearer. She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. He was a man in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. His face was a map of hardship, etched with lines around his eyes and mouth. But there was a quiet dignity to him. He was not just a brute of the mountains. He was a man of substance. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Thank you for everything." He nodded. "Caleb Miller, and you're welcome." She hesitated, then gestured toward her feet, now wrapped in fresh bandages. Did you see?" He knew what she was asking. He had seen the brand on her calf. She was a woman of good breeding. He just looked at her, his expression unchanging. Didn't look. It was a simple lie, and they both knew it. He had to have seen the brand, a small, subtle tattoo of her family's crest, a shield with an eagle. It was a sign of old money, of lineage. It marked her as an heiress, a person who lived in a different world than his. But he was a man of honor. He had chosen to respect her privacy, to pretend he hadn't seen something so intimate. It was a small gesture, but it meant a great deal. "My father, he was Silas Vance, the banker from Helena," she began, her voice cracking slightly. "He was killed. Ambushed? For this." She reached for the ledger, which was on the table beside her plate. Caleb's eyes flickered to the ledger, then back to her face. He didn't ask her what was in it. He just listened. It's a detailed record of land deals, shady loans, and illegal transactions. My father was going to use it to expose some very powerful people, men who have been robbing people blind for years. Caleb's expression hardened, a brief flash of something that looked like anger or bitterness. He knew men like that. They were a different kind of predator than the ones he was used to. They thought I was dead too, she said, her voice a whisper. They searched the wagon. I hid. I waited until they were gone, and then I ran. I just ran. Caleb nodded. He didn't offer platitudes or empty words of comfort. He just listened. He was a man of actions, not words. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was a shared space of understanding. I have to get back, she said, her voice filled with a sudden, frantic urgency. I have to report this. I have to see them brought to justice. Caleb let out a low, humorless chuckle. Report it to whom? The sheriff? The lawmen out here are just as likely to be on their payroll. You'd be a dead woman before you made it halfway to the nearest town. His words were a splash of cold water. He was right. She had been so focused on survival that she hadn't considered the reality of the situation. Her father's enemies were powerful. They would have men everywhere. She was a liability, a loose end. So what do I do? She asked, a fragile desperation in her voice. Caleb stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the brilliant, sun-drenched landscape. You stay here, he said simply, until the weather clears for good, until you're strong enough to travel. I've a feeling they'll be looking for a dead body, not a live one. They'll be watching the roads. And you? She asked. You'll be in danger too, if they find out you're hiding me. He turned, and a fleeting, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a sad smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. This is my ranch, Eleanor. I built it with my own 2 hands. I don't run from anyone. His words were a final, unspoken confirmation of his character. He was a man of solitude, a man of his word, and a man who was willing to take on a fight he didn't have to. The banker's daughter and the rugged rancher, 2 people from different worlds, had been thrown together by fate. Their story was just beginning. The days that followed were a surreal blur for Eleanor. The cabin was a world unto itself, a small island of warmth and safety in a vast, unforgiving wilderness. Her life had been one of luxury and social expectations, piano lessons, afternoon teas, the latest Parisian fashions. Now her days were a study in simple survival. Caleb was a man of routines. He rose with the sun, went out to tend to his horses and a small flock of sheep, and spent his afternoons mending fences or hunting for food. He was a master of his domain, a man who knew the mountains like the back of his hand. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his presence a comforting hum of activity. Eleanor, still recovering, spent her time by the fire, watching him. She found herself fascinated by the contrast between her life and his. He didn't need a bank to be rich. His wealth was in the land, in his skill, in the silent confidence that came from living a life of honest work. She, the girl with the brand on her calf, was the true pauper in this environment. Their conversations were sparse, but meaningful. He taught her how to build a fire from scratch, how to clean a rifle, how to read the signs of the weather. He was a patient teacher, never condescending, always pragmatic. He spoke of the land, of the mountains, of the animals he hunted. He was a man who lived in the present, a man whose mind was focused on the next meal, the next snowfall, the next day. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Eleanor finally asked him about his past. "You live out here all alone, Caleb. Did you ever have a family?" He paused, staring into the flames. His face was a mask of shadows and light. "I had a wife," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "and a son." He didn't elaborate, and she knew better than to pry. The silence that followed was heavy, with a story untold, a grief that was still raw after all these years. She had lost her father, and she knew the weight of that loss. But his was a different kind of pain, a deep-seated wound that had never healed. She saw the sadness in his eyes, a flicker of a ghost of a life that could have been. He finally spoke again, his voice back to its usual steady tone. "The mountains. They can take everything from you if you're not careful. People. People can take it, too. The second part of the sentence was left unfinished, but she understood. He had been hurt, deeply, by someone. His isolation wasn't a choice. It was a wall he had built to protect himself. He was a man who had lost his family, and he had learned to live with the ghosts of his past. The ledger was still on the table. She had looked at it a few times, but she had not opened it. She was afraid of what she would find. It was a tangible link to her old life, a life of wealth, privilege, and danger. She felt a growing sense of detachment from it all. Her father's mission, his fight against the powerful men of the city, it all seemed so distant and unreal here, in the quiet, simple world of Caleb Miller. She was changing. The delicate, refined girl from Helena was being chipped away, replaced by a tougher, more resilient woman. She was learning to chop wood, to cook a simple meal, to endure the silence of the mountains. She was learning that her life, her true life, was not defined by the money in her father's bank, but by her own will to survive. One afternoon, a sharp, distant sound broke the quiet. A gunshot. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. Caleb, who was sharpening an axe outside, froze. He looked toward the source of the sound, his face a mask of concentration. "What was that?" she whispered, her hands clasped tightly. "Rifle," he said, his voice low. "Sounds like it came from the North Ridge." He went inside, his movements quick and decisive. He grabbed his rifle and a satchel. "Stay inside," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Don't open the door for anyone. No matter what." "Are you going to see?" she asked, a note of panic in her voice. "I'm going to see if it's a hunter in trouble," he said. A lie she knew was only a half-truth. He was going to see if it was danger, the kind of danger she had brought to his doorstep. He put on his coat, and a moment later he was gone, a solitary figure disappearing into the vast, snow-covered landscape. Eleanor was alone again, but this time it was different. This time, she wasn't completely alone. She had a guardian, a silent protector. She sat by the window, her heart a drumbeat of anxiety, watching the empty space where he had been, praying for his safe return. Caleb Miller was a man of caution, and the distant gunshot was a sound that broke the peaceful solitude he had cultivated for years. He knew the difference between the sound of a deer hunter and something more sinister. This was the latter. It was too close, too deliberate. He moved through the snow with the grace and silence of a hunter, his senses on high alert. He came upon the scene on the North Ridge about an hour later. The snow was trampled, a messy canvas of tracks, men's boots and the hooves of a horse. There was a campfire, now a smouldering pile of embers and discarded tins of food. They had been here for a while, camped out. They weren't lost. They were waiting. His eyes swept over the tracks. 2 men. The footprints were large and heavy. They were headed toward his cabin. A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. They were hunting, and he knew who they were hunting. Eleanor. He knew he had to get back. He turned, his movements quick and purposeful, but a sound made him freeze, a low, mocking chuckle. "Well, well," a rough voice said. "Look what the blizzard dragged in." Caleb turned slowly. Standing on a rock ledge above him were 2 men. One was short and stocky, with a scarred face and a cruel smile. The other was a mountain of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a long, unkempt beard. His eyes, though, were a shocking icy blue. Caleb knew him, Jackson Thorne, a name whispered in the darkest corners of Montana, a ruthless man with a reputation for violence and a cold disregard for human life. He was a rival of Caleb's from a lifetime ago, a rivalry that had ended in a way that left both men with deep scars. "Thorne," Caleb said, his voice as flat as the Montana plains. "Miller," Thorne replied, his voice a low growl. "Heard you found yourself a little lost lamb, the banker's daughter. Heard she was walking alone in the snow for 4 days. A real miracle, ain't it?" Caleb's grip on his rifle tightened. "Don't know what you're talking about." Thorne laughed again, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't play dumb, Miller. You've always been a fool for a lost cause. You take her in, you protect her, and what do you get? a target on your back. We're here for the girl and the ledger. You hand them over, and we walk away. No harm done." "There's no girl here. I'm just out hunting," Caleb said, his mind racing. He had to get back to the cabin. He had to warn Eleanor. "Don't lie to me," Thorn said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I know her father's ledger is worth a fortune. A lot of powerful people want it, and a lot of powerful people want you out of the way. You get in my way, Miller, and you won't be the only one to fall." Caleb knew he was talking about more than just himself. He was talking about the life he had built, the solitude he had found. He was threatening to burn it all down. "You're a fool to get mixed up in this, Miller," Thorn continued, his eyes glinting with malice. "I'm offering you a chance to walk away. You're a man of the land. You don't belong in this world of city politics and greed." "And you do?" Caleb challenged, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "You're just a scavenger, Thorn. You always have been. You feed on the weak." Thorn's face hardened. "Watch your mouth, Miller. You don't know who you're talking to." "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Caleb said, his voice steady. "You're the man who stole everything from me, my wife, my son, and you'll never take another thing. Not from me, not from her." Thorn's eyes narrowed. The long-standing feud, the bitter history between them, was now out in the open. It wasn't just about the ledger anymore. It was personal. "You've sealed your fate, Miller," Thorn said. "We'll be at your cabin. You'll be there. You won't be able to protect her from us. We'll take the ledger and we'll burn that cabin to the ground with her in it, and then we'll finish what we started." Caleb didn't respond. He just turned and began to walk away, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. He was outmatched. 2 against 1. They would be at the cabin before him. He had to find a way to distract them, to lead them on a wild goose chase. He couldn't let them get to Eleanor. He began to run, the snow a silent cold blanket under his boots. He was not a young man anymore, but he was a man of the mountains, and he knew how to move. He had to be a ghost, a phantom in the snow. He had to outwit them, to outrun them. His old enemy, Jackson Thorn, was coming for him, and this time Caleb had something to lose. The run back to the cabin was the longest of Caleb Miller's life. He was no longer the quiet, stoic rancher. He was a man on a mission, his heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. Every step was a prayer, a desperate plea to the unforgiving mountains to grant him speed, to give him a chance to save the woman he had just met. He knew Thorn's ruthless nature. His threat to burn the cabin with Eleanor inside was not an empty boast. It was a promise. Caleb had seen the depths of Thorn's cruelty before. He would have to be clever, not just fast. As he ran, he thought of a plan. He had a secondary route to his cabin, a hidden trail that cut through a series of narrow canyons and led to a back entrance. It was a dangerous path, one he only used for emergencies, but this was an emergency. It would be a shortcut, but it would also leave him exposed. He knew the risk. He veered off the main trail, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The canyons were a maze of rock and ice. He moved with a practiced ease, his body remembering the path it had taken so many times before. The air was thin here, the wind a relentless, biting thing. But he didn't stop. He was a man of solitude, a man who had built a life of walls and defenses. He had sworn to himself he would never let anyone in again, that he would never have anything to lose. But now he had something. Eleanor. The thought of her, alone in his cabin, defenseless against Thorn and his men, was a fire in his belly. He was fighting for her, a stranger who had trusted him with her life, a trust he would not betray. He heard the sound of a horse's gallop in the distance. Thorn was on the move. They were coming, and they were closing in. He pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort. He was a man fighting for a life he had just found, a life he didn't know he wanted until now. He finally reached the back of his cabin, a small hidden entrance that was barely visible from the main path. He burst inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. Eleanor was standing by the fireplace, her face a mask of worry. The ledger was in her hand. "Caleb!" she cried, her voice filled with relief. "What happened? I heard a shot." He was out of breath, his chest heaving. "No time," he gasped. "They know you're here. Thorne, Jackson Thorne, they're coming. We have to go." He was already moving, grabbing 2 rifles, a sack of dried meat and a canteen. He gestured to her. "The horses in the stable. We'll take the high road. They won't expect it." Eleanor, despite her fear, did not hesitate. She put the ledger in the sack and grabbed a thick coat. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Caleb didn't answer. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a grim determination. The past was catching up with them, a ghost from his life that had come back to haunt him. He had to get her out of here. He had to protect her from the man who had taken everything from him once before. They moved quickly. He led her out the back door, and they ran to the stable. The horses, 2 sturdy, well-trained Mustangs, were already saddled. He had prepared them for a quick escape, a premonition of the danger that was to come. They mounted and rode out into the cold, silent world. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows on the snow. The wind picked up, a cold, hungry beast. They rode for a long time, the only sound, the pounding of the horses' hooves and the rush of the wind. He didn't speak. He just rode, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand on his rifle. He was a sentinel, a protector. Eleanor rode silently behind him, her eyes on his back, a symbol of a strength she didn't have. She knew he was protecting her, and she knew he was in danger because of it. They reached a high ridge, and he finally stopped. He dismounted and looked back. Down below, in the valley, a small flame flickered. A fire. His cabin. Thorne had found it. The fire grew, a furious, devouring beast, a symbol of the vengeance that was now chasing them. Eleanor gasped, a choked sob escaping her lips. They burned it." Caleb nodded, his face a grim mask. "They'll assume we're inside," he said, his voice flat. "They'll think we're dead. It'll buy us some time." He didn't tell her the rest of it. He didn't tell her that Thorne had done this before. He had burned down his life, and now he was trying to burn it down again. They rode on, into the darkness. They were on the run. 2 fugitives in a cold, unforgiving world. The banker's daughter and the stoic rancher. Their pasts had finally caught up with them, and now they had to face it together. The small town of Silver Creek was a beacon of civilization in the vast wilderness of Montana. It was a dusty, wind-battered place, with a handful of saloons, a general store, and a livery stable. It was a far cry from the bustling streets of Helena, but to Eleanor and Caleb, it was a sanctuary. They had been on the run for 2 days, sleeping in caves and eating dried meat. They had to sell one of Caleb's horses to buy supplies and a change of clothes. They were now 2 people traveling incognito, a cowboy and his sister, or so they told anyone who asked. Eleanor had been forced to cut her long city hair to make her less recognizable, a sacrifice that was both symbolic and necessary. She had traded her fine clothes for a simple, homespun dress and a pair of worn leather boots. She was now a ghost, a phantom of her former self. They had to be careful. The people her father had crossed were powerful and well-connected. They would be watching the roads, the train stations. Silver Creek was off the beaten path, but it wasn't safe. They stayed in a small, run-down boarding house, a place with thin walls and a smell of stale pipe smoke. Eleanor lay awake at night, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building, her mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. She was responsible for all of this. Her father's ambition, his ledger, his death, the loss of Caleb's cabin, it was all her fault. One night she couldn't sleep. She found Caleb sitting outside, his back to the wall, a mug of coffee in his hand. The moon was full, a bright, cold disk in the sky. "Caleb," she said softly. He looked up, his face a shadow. Eleanor couldn't sleep. "No," she said. She sat beside him. "I need to ask you something." He just waited, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Who is Jackson Thorne?" she asked, her voice a whisper. You knew him, didn't you? When you said he took everything from you, was that your family?" He took a long sip of his coffee. The silence stretched between them, a heavy, unspoken thing. Then he spoke, his voice low and filled with a pain that was 1,000 years old. "My wife, Sarah, and I, we had a small ranch, not far from here. It was a good life. We were happy. Jackson Thorne. He was my neighbor, a good-for-nothing, a drunk and a bully. He wanted my land. He tried to buy it, but I wouldn't sell. He got a lot of powerful men in the city to back him. He wanted to build a road through my land to get to the silver mines." "What happened?" she asked, her heart a drumbeat of dread. "One night, I was out hunting. I came back, and the cabin was on fire. I ran. I tried to save them, but it was too late." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I tried to fight the fire, but it was too big. They were gone." He didn't need to say another word. She understood. The fire had taken his wife and son. Thorne had burned it down. It was a calculated, cruel act of revenge, a message. "I went to the sheriff," he continued, his voice now a bitter monotone. "He said it was an accident, said a lantern must have fallen, said there was no proof of arson. But I knew Thorne did it. He came to me a few days later and told me. He laughed. He said I should have sold him the land, said it was my fault. I almost killed him. I almost broke my vow. But I let him go. I just left. I lost everything. My family, my home, my will to live. I just disappeared, became a ghost. Thorne took everything." Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. The weight of his grief was a physical thing. He was not just a man who had lost his family. He was a man who had been destroyed, a soul shattered by an act of unspeakable cruelty. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a deep, bottomless sadness. "Don't be," he said. "You didn't know. You didn't bring this on me. It was already here. I couldn't stand by and let him do it to you too." His words were a confession, a testament to the man he was. He was a protector, a man who had been broken by violence but had not lost his sense of right and wrong. He had chosen to save her, even though it meant facing his greatest enemy, the man who had burned his life to the ground. The weight of the secret was now shared between them. The fire that had destroyed his past was now chasing them in the present. They were not just on the run from Thorne and his men. They were on the run from a past that refused to stay buried. The morning after their conversation, the mood between Eleanor and Caleb had shifted. The unspoken wall that had stood between them had been broken down. They were no longer a rescuer and a rescued. They were two people with a shared enemy, two souls burdened by a common tragedy. They knew they couldn't stay in Silver Creek for long. It was too risky. They needed to move, to find a place where Thorne and his men would never think to look. Caleb had an idea, a long-shot plan. "I know a man," he said as they rode out of town. "A retired lawman. He lives in the hills, not far from the old Miller ranch. He's a good man. He's the only one I would trust with this. His name is Sam Cole. He used to be the sheriff of this region, a long time ago." Eleanor looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Can we trust him?" "With my life," Caleb said, his voice firm. "He knew Thorne. He knew what kind of man he was. He just couldn't prove it. He helped me in the aftermath. He's a man who believes in justice, even when the law fails." They rode for 2 days, traveling through dense forests and over treacherous mountain passes. The landscape was a silent, beautiful thing, but a sense of danger was always present, a cold shiver down their spines. They were a couple on the run, two people with a secret that could get them killed. They finally reached a small, isolated cabin nestled in a high valley. It was a rustic place, built of logs and stone, with a wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. A lone figure sat on the porch, a man with a grizzled beard and eyes that held a lifetime of stories. He was polishing a rifle. Caleb dismounted and approached the cabin. "Sam!" he called out. The man looked up, his eyes narrowing. He recognized the voice, but not the face. Then he saw Caleb's eyes. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile. "Caleb Miller," he said, his voice filled with a quiet surprise. "Last I heard, you were a ghost." Caleb gave a tired shrug. Some ghosts never rest. The men clasped hands, a silent testament to a long-standing friendship. Sam's eyes then fell on Eleanor, who was still on her horse, a nervous look on her face. "Who's this?" he asked. "This is Eleanor Vance," Caleb said. "And she has a story you're going to want to hear, and a ledger that will bring down some very powerful men." Sam's eyes flickered to the ledger, which Eleanor was now holding. He knew the name Vance. The whole state of Montana did. He gestured for them to come inside. The cabin was small but clean, filled with books and maps. It was the home of a man who had retired from the world, but had never stopped thinking. Inside, over mugs of strong coffee, Eleanor told her story. She spoke of her father's mission, the ambush, the days of walking in the snow, and the rescue by Caleb. She spoke of the ledger and the powerful men it could expose. She then told him of Thorn and how he had come after them, burning Caleb's cabin. Sam listened in silence, his expression grim. When she was finished, he let out a low whistle. Silas Vance was a stubborn man. He always had a way of stirring up trouble. But he was an honest man. I'll give him that. And Thorn, I always knew that man was a snake. He got away with murder once. He won't get away with it again. He looked at Caleb. You did the right thing, son. You brought her here. We'll find a way to get this ledger to the right people. People who aren't on Thorn's payroll. A glimmer of hope ignited in Eleanor's heart. She was no longer a lone fugitive. She had a protector, a guardian, and now an ally. The simple, quiet world of Caleb Miller had expanded to include a new player, a man who had dedicated his life to justice. Sam took the ledger and opened it. He paged through the intricate notes and the detailed records. "This is a gold mine," he said, a sense of awe in his voice. Silas Vance was a meticulous man. He had everything in here: names, dates, transactions. This is a map to their entire operation. This could bring down half the power brokers in Helena. He looked up at Caleb. "You're in deep, son. Deeper than you know. Thorn won't rest until he has this. We'll have to be smart. We'll have to be one step ahead." Caleb just nodded. He had known the risks from the beginning. He had known that by saving her, he was stepping back into the world he had left behind, but he didn't regret it. He looked at Eleanor, her face now filled with a sense of purpose. He was no longer just a ghost. He was a man with a mission. He had something to fight for. The story was no longer just about survival. It was about a fight for justice, about an unlikely alliance, and about a redemption that was just beginning. The three of them, a grieving daughter, a stoic rancher, and a retired lawman, were now united against a common enemy. The Old West was a dangerous place, but it was also a place where a new life could be forged and a new future could be won. The little cabin in the hills became a war room. Sam, with his years of experience as a lawman, was the strategist. Caleb, the man of the mountains, was the tactician. And Eleanor, the city girl who was learning to be tough, was the heart of their mission. The ledger, the physical evidence of her father's life and death, lay open on the table, its pages filled with names and numbers that painted a picture of greed and corruption. "This is a very specific kind of war," Sam said, tracing a finger along the page. "They won't just be looking for the ledger. They'll be looking for you, Eleanor. You're the loose end, the witness, and they'll be looking for you, Caleb, because you're a man who doesn't stay down. Jackson Thorne knows you. He'll want to finish what he started." Caleb nodded, his face grim. "He wants to hurt me, to break me, and the easiest way to do that is to take away what I'm protecting." Eleanor's heart ached at the words. She was the reason he was in danger. She was the catalyst for this new conflict. She had to do something more than just hide. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. We can't just go to the sheriff. You said he's probably on their payroll. We don't, Sam said, a glint in his eye. We go to the one man who isn't, the territorial governor. He's a righteous man, a new man in these parts. He came to Montana to clean up the state. We'll take the ledger directly to him. But we have to do it in a way that Thorne can't stop us. We can't just ride into Helena. He'll be watching every road, every train station, Caleb added. We'll be a target from the minute we leave. Then we don't go by road, Eleanor said, an idea forming in her mind. The old mining trails, the ones that no one uses anymore. My father used to talk about them. He said they were a secret network, a way to move goods without anyone knowing. Caleb and Sam looked at her. It was a crazy idea, a suicide mission. The trails were treacherous, unmapped and filled with dangers, but it was also the only way. It was the one route Thorne wouldn't expect them to take. It's dangerous, Caleb said. A lot of those trails are washed out. We'd be on our own. We're on our own anyway, Eleanor countered, and we have this. She tapped the ledger. This is our only weapon. We have to use it. A quiet respect filled the room. The delicate banker's daughter was gone. In her place was a woman of steel, a woman who had found her purpose in the face of tragedy. The plan was set. They would travel by night using the old mining trails. Sam would provide them with supplies, maps, and 2 of his best horses. He would create a diversion, a feint to draw Thorne and his men away from their true path. They'll be looking for 3 people, Sam said. They'll expect us to ride together. I'll make sure they think we're heading for the main road. I'll ride out, make sure they see me, and then I'll lead them on a wild goose chase. You 2 will take the high road. The plan was risky, a gamble with their lives, but it was the only shot they had. They spent the next few days preparing. Sam taught Eleanor how to ride with more than just a passing grace. He showed her how to handle a rifle, how to load and fire. She was a quick study, her mind absorbing every lesson with a fierce determination. Caleb taught her how to read the landscape, how to find shelter, how to make a fire in a hurry. Their bond deepened with every lesson, a silent trust forming between them. The night of their departure was a cold, starless night. The wind howled a mournful tune. Sam handed them their supplies, 2 sacks filled with food, water, and ammunition. He looked at Caleb, a silent question in his eyes. "You'll come back, son," Sam said, his voice low. "I have a reason to now," Caleb said, glancing at Eleanor. Eleanor, who was already on her horse, looked at Sam. "Thank you for everything. Be safe, girl," Sam said, a rare note of warmth in his voice. "You're a good woman. Your father would be proud." They rode out into the darkness, a single solitary unit against a world that wanted them dead. They were a man who had lost everything, a woman who had lost her life, and a book of secrets that could bring an empire of lies to its knees. The journey had begun. The stakes had never been higher. The first few days on the trail were a grueling test of endurance. The mining trails were a treacherous maze of narrow ledges, steep climbs, and jagged rocks. The horses, though sure-footed, moved slowly, their hooves clattering on the loose stones. Eleanor, who had only ever ridden for pleasure, was now a woman on a mission, her body aching with a fatigue she had never known. Caleb, a natural in the wild, was a silent and steady guide. He led them through the treacherous passes, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He was a sentinel, a protector, his senses finely tuned to the dangers of the wilderness. He knew every turn, every hidden cave, every watering hole. He was a ghost in this landscape, a man who had lived a life of solitude and survival. They spoke very little. The silence between them was a comfortable one, a shared understanding of their purpose. They were a team, a unit. He would stop to check on her, his eyes asking the questions she didn't have to answer. He would point out landmarks, teach her how to identify the tracks of animals, and show her which plants were safe to eat. One evening, they stopped in a small cave for the night. The fire, a small, cautious thing, cast a warm, dancing light on their faces. Eleanor was tending to the horses when Caleb approached her. "You're doing well," he said, his voice low. "A lot of people would have given up by now." Eleanor shrugged, her eyes on the horses. "I don't have a choice. This is the only way." "No," he said, his voice filled with a quiet conviction. "You do. You could have left me behind. You could have left the ledger behind. You could have just run. But you didn't. That's a choice." She looked at him, and for a moment the firelight caught his eyes, and she saw the pain, the grief, and the quiet admiration in them. He was a man who had been alone for so long, a man who had been hurt so deeply, but he was choosing to trust again. "I couldn't," she said, her voice a whisper. "This isn't just about my father anymore. It's about you too. I can't let him win. I can't let him destroy another life. Not yours." A silent moment passed between them. The words hung in the air, a confession of her feelings. It was more than gratitude. It was a deeper emotion, a connection forged in the fires of shared hardship and danger. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, a tender gesture that was a shocking, beautiful thing in this desolate world. "Then let's not let him," he said. The unspoken tension between them had finally broken. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement of their growing bond. They were no longer just two people on the run. They were two souls finding their way back to each other, a broken man and a lost woman, finding a sense of purpose and a sense of connection in the middle of a brutal, unforgiving world. Meanwhile, back at the main road, Thorne and his men were frustrated. They had been chasing a ghost. Sam, with his knowledge of the land, was leading them on a wild goose chase, a trail that led nowhere. "That old man is toying with us," Thorne snarled, his eyes filled with a cold rage. "He's leading us in circles. The girl and the ledger. They're not with him. They're somewhere else." He looked at his men, his face a mask of fury. "I know Miller. He's not a man who runs, he's a man who hides, and I know the one place he would hide, the old mining trails." He had been right. He had guessed their plan. But by the time he realized his mistake, Caleb and Eleanor were already a day's ride ahead of him, deep in the treacherous, unmarked territory of the mountains. The race was now on. The hunter had become the hunted, and the vengeance of a powerful man was a cold wind at their backs. The high country was beautiful, but it was also a cruel and unforgiving place. The sun was hot during the day, but the nights were freezing. The air was thin, and the terrain was a constant challenge. They had been on the trail for over a week, their food running low, their energy wearing thin. Eleanor was no longer the frail girl from Helena. Her hands were calloused, her face was weathered, and her body was stronger than it had ever been. She could ride for hours without complaint, her mind focused on the destination. The ledger, now wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was her constant companion, a symbol of her father's life, and a constant reminder of the reason for her journey. They had been following a narrow trail along a high cliff when Caleb's horse suddenly reared up, a panicked whinny escaping its throat. Caleb, a man who had a way with horses, was caught off guard. He was thrown from the saddle, and his body slammed against the rock face. Eleanor watched in horror as he fell, a limp form to the ground. She dismounted in a panic, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her chest. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling. He was unconscious, a small trickle of blood running from a cut on his forehead. His arm was bent at an unnatural angle. It was a bad fall. She had no medical training. She had only seen doctors in their clean, sterile offices. Here, in the middle of nowhere, she was on her own. She had to act. She had to be strong. She carefully checked his pulse. It was there, a faint, steady beat. He was alive. She used her shirt to gently wipe the blood from his forehead. She looked around, her eyes desperate. There was no one, just the mountains, the rocks, and the silence. She had to get him to shelter. She was not strong enough to carry him, so she used the horses, a makeshift stretcher from some branches and blankets. It was a slow, agonizing process. She was exhausted, her body screaming in protest, but she pushed on, her mind focused on one thing: getting him to safety. She found a small, hidden cave, a place that Caleb had pointed out to her a few days before. She pulled him inside, away from the cold wind. She built a fire, her hands now surprisingly adept at the task. The warmth from the fire was a blessed relief. She sat by his side all night tending to him, her eyes fixed on his face, her mind a whirlwind of fear and worry. She had been saved by him. Now it was her turn to save him. When he finally came to, it was morning. He groaned, his face a mask of pain. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice a hoarse croak. "I'm here, Caleb," she said, a wave of relief washing over her. He tried to sit up, but a sharp stab of pain in his arm made him stop. "My arm, it's broken," he said, his voice flat. Eleanor nodded. "I know. We have to set it." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a grim understanding. "You've never done anything like this before." "No," she said, her voice firm, "but I can learn. You taught me to survive. Now you have to let me." She found two small, flat pieces of wood and used strips of her torn dress to make splints. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "This is going to hurt, Caleb." He just nodded. He was a man of the mountains. He knew pain. He was a man who had endured a broken spirit. A broken arm was nothing compared to that. She worked slowly, her hands trembling, but her mind focused. She set the bone, the sickening sound of it a sharp crack in the silence of the cave. He grunted, a low, guttural sound of pain, but he didn't scream. She wrapped the splint tightly, her hands now covered in blood, but she didn't flinch. When she was finished, she sat back, her body trembling with exhaustion. He looked at her, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "You're a Vance, all right," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "You fight." She smiled back, a tired, watery smile. "I learned from the best." They were no longer two separate people. They were a team, a unit. He had taught her how to survive, and now she had saved him. The brush with death had brought them closer. It had sealed their bond, a silent promise to protect each other, no matter the cost. The fall had slowed them down. Caleb was in pain, his arm in a splint, his movements limited. Eleanor had to do the work of two people, tending to the horses, finding firewood, and making sure Caleb was as comfortable as possible. The delay was dangerous. It gave Thorn and his men time to catch up. They were a day's ride from Helena when they saw them. A cloud of dust in the distance, a group of riders on the main road. Caleb, his eyes narrowed, knew who they were. Thorn and his men. They were a mile or two away, but they were closing in. "We can't outrun them," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "Not with my arm like this. We have to hide." They veered off the road into the dense forest and found a small hidden cave. They hid the horses behind a thick screen of trees, and then they waited. The sound of the horses' hooves grew louder, a relentless drumbeat of vengeance. Thorn and his men rode past their hiding spot, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the horizon. Thorn was a man on a mission, a man consumed by a cold, relentless fury. He was so close, he could almost taste his victory. But he didn't see them. He rode on, his mind fixed on Helena. He was certain they would be riding into town. He was so convinced that he didn't notice the small, insignificant cave hidden in the trees. He was a man who saw what he wanted to see, not what was actually there. After they were gone, Caleb let out a slow breath of relief. "He's a good tracker," he said. "But he's a fool. He's looking for the girl he expects to see, not the woman you've become." Eleanor, her heart still hammering in her chest, nodded. She was no longer the pampered daughter of a banker. She was a woman who had faced death and found her courage. She was a survivor. They waited for a few more hours until the sun was setting. They knew they had to move. They had to get to Helena, to the governor's mansion. They had to finish this. They rode into the night, their movements slow and cautious. They were close. They could see the lights of Helena in the distance, a small, hopeful constellation against the dark canvas of the mountains. The town was a living, breathing thing, a place of people, of law, of order. It was their destination, their sanctuary. But they weren't alone. A lone figure had separated from Thorn's group, a man on a horse. He was coming after them, a silent, predatory ghost in the darkness. It was Jackson Thorn himself. He had doubled back, a man consumed by his need for revenge. He had known Caleb would be clever. He had known he would not ride the main road. He had anticipated his move. He caught up with them on the outskirts of town in a small, desolate canyon. He was a man with nothing to lose, a man driven by a cold, merciless rage. "Miller!" he roared, his voice a chilling echo in the canyon. "I knew you wouldn't be able to stay away. I knew you'd come back." Caleb drew his rifle, his movements slow, his arm a throbbing mess of pain. "Thorn," he said, his voice as flat as the Montana plains, "it ends here." "It ends here for you," Thorn snarled. "You should have stayed a ghost, Miller. You should have let the past stay buried. But you just had to get involved, and now you're going to pay for it, both of you." He was a man consumed by a need for vengeance, a man who saw Caleb not as a man, but as a symbol of everything he had lost. The fire, the family, the life he had destroyed, it had all come back to haunt him. The duel was a silent, tense affair. The two men, two ghosts of a past conflict, faced each other in the darkness. The banker's daughter, now a hardened survivor, watched in silence, her hand on her own pistol, ready to fight. She would not let him take Caleb from her, not after all they had been through. The canyon was a stage for a final act of violence. The two men, Caleb and Thorn, stood a dozen feet apart, their rifles raised. Eleanor was on her horse, a silent spectator to a conflict that was older than she was. Thorn was faster. He had two good arms, and he was a man who lived and breathed violence. He fired first, the sound of the rifle a deafening crack in the silence. The bullet whizzed past Caleb's head, a hair's breadth from his ear. Caleb, despite his broken arm, didn't flinch. He was a man of patience, a man who knew how to wait for his moment. Thorn was overconfident. He had the advantage, and he knew it. He took a step forward, a sneer on his face. "You can't win, Miller," he said. "You're a half-man. You're done." "I'm not done," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "I'm just getting started." He raised his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate. He took aim, not at Thorn, but at his horse. Thorn, a man who had no respect for human life, had a powerful connection to his horse. It was his most prized possession. Caleb fired. The horse whinnied in pain, its leg shattered by the bullet. It fell, a crumpled heap, sending Thorn tumbling to the ground. Thorn's rifle flew from his hands, clattering on the rocks. Thorn lay on the ground, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. He had been outsmarted. Caleb had taken away his most powerful weapon, his horse. He was now a man on the ground, a man who was no match for Caleb in a hand-to-hand fight. "You're a coward, Thorn," Caleb said, walking toward him, his rifle still aimed at him. "You always have been. You're a man who fights with fire and lies. You're a man who preys on the weak. You're a coward." Thorn, his face twisted with fury, reached for a hidden pistol in his boot. He was a man who would never surrender. He would rather die fighting than live in defeat. Eleanor, her eyes fixed on him, saw the movement. She knew he was going to try to kill Caleb. She drew her own pistol, her hand steady, her heart a drumbeat of determination. "No!" she screamed. Thorn, in his rage, didn't hear her. He just saw Caleb, a symbol of his past and a threat to his future. He drew the pistol from his boot, a flash of steel in the darkness. Eleanor fired. The shot was clean and precise. It hit him in the shoulder, a non-fatal shot, but one that sent him sprawling. The pistol flew from his hand, and he screamed in pain and disbelief. Caleb looked at her, a look of surprise and pride in his eyes. She had saved him. She, the city girl, had faced down a killer and won. He walked over to Thorn, his face a grim mask of satisfaction. "It's over, Thorn," he said. "You're done." He took the ledger from his sack and threw it on the ground. "This ledger, it's going to bring you down. And your friends. You'll be a forgotten man, a footnote in history." Thorn, his face a mask of defeat, just lay there, the cold wind whipping around him, a man who had lost everything. He had been a predator for so long, a man who had feasted on the misfortune of others. And now he was a broken, defeated thing, a ghost of a man. They left him there, a wounded, broken animal, to be found by the sheriff. They rode on, into the light of the town, two fugitives now, with the weight of the past finally lifted from their shoulders. The night was cold, but the future was a warm, bright thing. They rode into Helena as the sun was rising, a magnificent spectacle of orange and pink against the mountains. The town was a bustling, living thing, a world of commerce and industry, a world that Eleanor had been a part of, but she was a different person now. The fancy dresses, the social obligations, the life she had left behind, it all felt distant, a memory from a different life. They went directly to the governor's mansion, a grand, stately building with a sense of authority. A guard, a young man with a skeptical look, stopped them at the gate. "We need to see the governor," Caleb said, his voice firm. "It's urgent. We have evidence of a conspiracy." The guard looked them up and down, a disheveled man with a broken arm and a young woman in a homespun dress. He was about to turn them away when Eleanor spoke. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I have my father's ledger. It contains proof of corruption at the highest level of this state. And if you don't let us in, a lot of people are going to get away with murder." The name Vance was a powerful one in Helena. The guard, his eyes widening, led them inside. The governor was a formidable man, a man with a sense of purpose and a desire to do good. He listened to their story, his expression grim. He looked at the ledger, his eyes scanning the names of the powerful men who had been a part of this conspiracy. "Silas Vance," he said, his voice filled with a quiet respect. "He was a good man. He was trying to do the right thing. And you too risked your lives for this. I will not let your sacrifice be in vain. I will see these men brought to justice." The governor's words were a balm to Eleanor's soul. Her father's sacrifice had not been for nothing. His legacy would live on. The men who had killed him would be brought to justice. In the days that followed, the story of the banker's daughter and the rancher became a legend. Thorn was found and arrested. The men in the ledger were investigated, and many of them were indicted. The world of Helena, the world of power and greed, was shaken to its core. A new era of justice was beginning. Eleanor was offered her father's bank, her old life, but she didn't want it. She had found something more valuable than money. She had found a purpose, a strength she never knew she had. She had found a home, not in a grand mansion, but in the quiet, stoic heart of a man who had saved her. One afternoon, she found Caleb sitting on a bench, looking out at the mountains. He was no longer the quiet, broken man she had met. He was a man with a purpose, a man who had found his way back to the world. "What are you going to do now, Caleb?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a peaceful light. "I have a lot of work to do. I need to rebuild my cabin. I need to get new horses. I need to get back to my life." "And what about me?" she asked, her heart in her throat. "Where do I fit into this picture?" He smiled, a rare, beautiful thing. He reached for her hand. His fingers, though still calloused, were gentle. "You don't fit into the picture, Eleanor. You are the picture. You are the reason I came back to the world. You're the reason I'm fighting to rebuild my life." She smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. The journey had been a long and difficult one. She had lost everything, but she had found something more. She had found a man who had been broken by his past, and she had helped him heal, and in doing so she had healed herself. He stood up and pulled her into his arms, a silent, powerful embrace. She was no longer just the banker's daughter. She was a woman who had walked alone in the snow for 4 days, and she had found a new life, a new home, and a new love in the arms of the rancher who had said, "Come." The future was uncertain, But for the first time in a long time, it was a future filled with hope.